In this talk, I'll describe a project where we are GPS tracking seabirds in the Fourth Tay region, with the objective of quantifying the population level consequences of displacement. This is a collaboration between UKCEH, RSPB and BIOS. In order to understand population level effects of offshore wind farms on birds, it's important to recognise that offshore wind farms act on individuals, not populations. And those effects on individuals depend on exposure, in other words, the encounter rate with offshore wind farms, and the severity, in other words, how severe is the effect on behaviour, energetics, and ultimately the demography of the individuals. It's important to study individual level effects because population averages will not capture this complexity. We are taking this individual-based approach in an empirical case study in the Fourth Tay region. In this study, there are 4 main species of concern in this context: kittiwake, puffin, guillemot and razorbill. Work is being undertaken under the post-consent monitoring requirements for the NNG and sea green wind farms and pre-consent monitoring by Berwick Bank. This work commenced in 2018 as a GPS tracking project which has taken place every year on the Isle of May on these species. The work is supplemented by a long understanding that we have of the ecology of seabirds on the Isle of May from our 50-year monitoring study that commenced in 1973. In 2021, our RSPB colleagues began GPS tracking at Fowlsheugh and St Apps Head on kittiwakes, so we now have 3 colonies where kittiwakes are being tracked. This study of these 4 species is also linked to the Bass Rock study of gannets being undertaken by the RSPB. Now, as you'll all be aware, the avian flu situation was very serious in some locations around Scotland in 2022, and so because of exclusions on licences, no tracking was undertaken in 2022, but baseline monitoring was continued. During the pre-construction phase, there are key metrics that we need to measure in order to estimate displacement effects. In terms of exposure, we want to understand the level of interaction with footprints, and we can get this from our GPS tracking data. For each individual, we want to understand its site fidelity, and that's the extent to which it might repeatedly return to the same location, such as the individual in the top right, or have a broader range of locations, such as the individual in the bottom left, and that will determine level of repeated exposure. And the second thing we want to measure is the severity, and during the pre-construction phase, what that is to understand the energetic budgets and body conditions of all of these ranges of behaviours that we're seeing, levels of interaction and site fidelity. We can then, once the wind farm has been constructed, compare how that has changed amongst individuals that interact to a greater or lesser extent. Another thing we need to measure during the pre-construction phase, again, so that we can compare with the post-construction phase, is behaviour at sea. So whilst what I showed in the last slide was locational information, we also need to understand what individuals are doing. Now that's important because their level of exposure and is going to depend on what their behaviour is. So put simply, for displacement effects, where their foraging is going to be most important, and for collision effects, it's when they're in flight is most important. And we can classify locations at sea into different behaviours, in particular commuting flight, resting and foraging, using models called hidden Markov models. And this allows us to partition the foraging trip into these key behaviours, and it gives us a much greater insight into the potential effects. And the last metrics to mention are the demographic consequences, the productivity and survival consequences of displacement. So again, during the pre-construction phase, Really what we're doing is an ecological study of the relationship between foraging ecology and demography. And we then have individuals that interact with the wind farms, like footprints such as those in the top right, and those that don't, such as the individual in the bottom left. And ultimately we can then compare that to how they respond, the demography responds once the wind farms have been built. And this is done through what's called a before, during, after gradient analysis. What we can look is at individual level change in behaviour and energetics with distance from wind farm, allowing us to account for other sources of variation in distribution, and ultimately to quantify population level effects of displacement for each colony. GPS tracking study can also look at collision impacts. And the aim here is to increase biological realism in collision predictions. And this will provide data to improve parameterization of collision risk models. This can be done by improving our understanding of 3D reactive behavior in the vicinity of turbines, but ultimately to account for variability in risk due to environmental conditions, behavioral states, and other factors in order to understand these collision effects. To summarise, these effects act on variation in demographic rates of individuals in relation to their exposure and severity. This individual-based approach is powerful in addressing this key question of population level impacts. The fourth day is a case study that aims to demonstrate this over the coming years, but we will need to factor in this new challenge of avian influenza. So it just leaves me to thank the funders for supporting and facilitating the project. That's NNG, Seagreen and Berwick Bank. Also all the field workers for their help in delivering these data, the landowners in providing access to the colonies, and finally, in terms of the insight we've obtained from the Isle of May long-term study, both the key individuals that have contributed to that, Mike Harris, Sarah Wanless and Mark Newell, and also the funders of that study, NERC and JNCC. Thank you very much.
Hi everyone, my name is Lila Buckingham and I am from the Norwegian Institute for Nature Research. But today I'm going to talk to you about some of the work that I undertook during my PhD at UKCH. So we're currently facing an energy crisis and governments around the world are aiming to switch their reliance from fossil fuels to more renewable sources of energy, such as offshore wind farms. The UK government, for example, has pledged to increase capacity of offshore wind to 50 gigawatts by 2030. But unfortunately, we don't understand how these developments may impact marine life, including seabirds. So seabirds can be impacted by offshore wind farms by two main ways. Firstly, through direct collision with turbines, and secondly, through displacement effects, which generally have energetic consequences. So where seabirds might have to take a longer trip by flying around a wind farm footprint, or might be pushed out of important foraging areas and lose access to those food resources. Displacement effects are particularly poorly understood, and especially during the non-breeding season, when seabird mortality is typically higher anyway. So assessments of displacement effects during the non-breeding season have historically been derived from at-sea survey data, which is a really important source of data, but unfortunately it's really difficult to link these distributions back to the breeding population. And as it's important to assess impacts on seabirds at the breeding population level, we need to improve this. So I aim to do this by using a multi-colony study to assess the population vulnerability, the population level vulnerability of two seabird species to displacement effects from offshore wind farms. So I assess this in the common guillemot here on the left and the raisbill on the right. And at each of our trapped colonies, we deployed geolocation immersion loggers, which recorded light and activity data. And from this, we derived distributions and behaviours, and therefore energy expenditure during the non-breeding season. So these maps show the trapped colonies for each of these species and analysis. So the trapped colonies are shown here in triangles, and we also included population size. And to do this, we included Seabird 2000 census data, so where people had counted the seabirds at all UK populations. And we assigned each of these untrapped colonies to their nearest trapped colony in order to create colony groupings that we could use in further analysis. So just to point out here that there are some areas that we felt were too far away from a trapped colony to include, and those untrapped colonies that are not included in these analyses are shown in dark grey. And just to say, please don't use the results from this study to infer vulnerability of these populations. So in guillemots, we had quite a good spread for most of Scotland and spreading down into Wales. In raisbills, for the density analysis, we had a good coverage of Scotland. And in the energetic analysis for raisbills, we unfortunately only had 3 colonies on the east coast of Scotland that had activity data. So that aspect, that analysis for raisbills focuses on those 3 colonies. So for each of these colony groupings, we extracted the monthly distribution and the mean monthly daily energy expenditure. Okay, so now on to some results. So I've got 2 maps here, guillemot on the left, raisbill on the right. And firstly, I'm going to show you the mean daily density. So this is the average number of birds that were present in each grid cell per day during the non-breeding season. And for these species, that is approximately July to March. A grid cell is going to appear, and the colour indicates the number of birds present per day. So higher densities are in yellow, lower densities are in purple. So as you can see, there was an area of very high density off the northeast coast of Scotland for both species, slightly different areas, but in this region nonetheless. In guillemots, areas of high density extended to the north and west coast of Scotland and the central North Sea. In raisbills, again, the north and west coast of Scotland, also down into the Celtic Sea, and then slightly further north in the North Sea than the guillemots. These figures show the total energy expenditure. So the energy expended by all individuals from all populations throughout the non-breeding season. So that's like the sum rather than the mean, as I showed for the densities. Again, there was an area of very high energy expenditure off the northeast coast of Scotland for both species. But in raisbills, as we only had the 3 east coast colonies, we've lost the data throughout the west coast, and therefore we don't see the high distribution and expenditure in that area. Then to put this into context with offshore wind farms, here I've presented 2 maps with wind farms that are already being developed or operational in grey polygons, and Scotland's sectoral marine plan, so areas proposed for development, highlighted as white, not filled in polygons. Then I've overlaid them on the mean daily densities, and you can see that there's quite high overlap with these proposed areas off the northeast coast of Scotland with areas of high density, and this appears to particularly be the case for raisbills. Then I've overlapped these on top of the areas of high energy expenditure, and again you see a high overlap, and that indicates that development of these areas may reduce access to non-breeding season foraging areas for these displacement vulnerable species, and may have energetic consequences. Thank you very much for listening, and thank you to my collaborators.
I'm going to talk about a new project called Ecosystem Change, Offshore Wind, Net Gain and Seabirds, or EcoWINGS. It's a project funded by the EcoWind Research Programme. The EcoWind Research Programme is a new programme funded by the Natural Environment Research Council and the Crown Estate. EcoWind aims to understand how offshore wind affects ecosystems and the species and habitats that make them, in order to reduce negative impacts on marine life while tackling climate change. EcoWINGS is one of 3 grants funded by the programme, and is a project led by ourselves at UKCEH in collaboration with the University of Strathclyde, Heriot-Watt University, BIOS, National Oceanography Centre, the University of Glasgow, and HiDef. EcoWINGS is tackling 3 main objectives. The first objective is to quantify the cumulative impacts of offshore wind on seabirds and the wider marine ecosystem. This has been a challenging topic, not least because we have a very limited understanding of the mechanisms behind the effects of offshore wind on birds. One of the most challenging processes is how displacement works, and in particular, whether it is birds that are directly displaced or whether their prey are displaced and they're responding to changes in behaviour of their prey. This has been a big challenge because of the lack of data that simultaneously quantify the distribution of fish and birds, and therefore we don't understand these processes in detail. Accordingly, this first objective will focus on the following activities. We will collect simultaneous high-resolution data on fish and seabirds distributions across offshore wind gradients using uncrewed vehicles, shown here in the pictures on the right. The upper picture shows an uncrewed surface vehicle that will have acoustic data and cameras to record birds and fish simultaneously, and the lower photo shows an underwater submarine that records fish distributions as well. And they look in opposite directions to give you distribution right through the water column. These will then operate in tandem with aerial survey data that's already been undertaken as part of post-consent monitoring. And the work will be undertaken in the Fourth Tay region, where offshore wind farms are currently being constructed and will be in operation over the course of the study. We will be collecting these data over 3 years, and over the course of that we will be analysing these data using advanced statistical analysis to understand the effects of offshore wind on predator-prey interactions, including habituation. And then we will scale up these interactions between seabirds, their prey and offshore wind from local to regional scales and ultimately at the North Sea scale in order to deliver that cumulative impact assessment at the scale in which strategic decisions need to be made. The second objective of EcoWINGS is to incorporate sufficient headroom to ensure assessments are robust to future climate change. As you'll all be aware, climate change is predicted to continue over the coming decades when the expansion of offshore wind is taking place. This is an important question because effects of offshore wind are always considered in relation to baseline conditions. So we can see factoring in climate change as factoring in a shifting baseline. We will tackle this by developing a series of linked models from physics to seabird population dynamics and ecosystem health under climate change. The first model will be a multi-model ensemble of hydrodynamic and phytoplankton conditions. On the one hand, this will feed into our ecosystem model, which is called Strath E2E, shown here with the long arrow at the base of the diagram. And then, looking at the upper part of the diagram, these models will feed into a series of trophic models, starting with 2 zooplankton models, one a statistical model and one a community model called Coltrane. These will feed into forage fish dynamic energy models and finally into seabird population dynamics models. The third objective of EcoWINGS is to investigate strategic compensatory measures that deliver net gain to seabirds in the ecosystem. We will develop a set of fisheries and non-fisheries compensation scenarios for achieving net gain, and we will do these together with stakeholders. This will feed into seabird population modelling to estimate effects of strategic compensation on seabirds, and this is shown here in the diagram on the right, where fisheries compensation alters prey projections with knock-on effects on survival and productivity of seabirds, and non-fisheries compensation, which tend to have more direct effects on survival and productivity of seabirds. And secondly, we'll look at the effectiveness of strategic compensation in delivering net gain to key ecosystem elements. We can bring these three objectives of EcoWINGS into one diagram, which shows historical change, which for many aspects of the North Sea ecosystem have been a story of decline, as shown here. Under climate change, these declines are predicted to continue. That's shown in the yellow, and that's the shifting baseline that I mentioned before. Many aspects of offshore wind farm effects are considered that they may be negative. That's not to say all will be, but in this illustration we show that on average there'll be negative consequences for seabirds and beyond, shown here in red. And then compensatory measures to deliver net gain will need to not just return us to the shifting baseline, but beyond, and that's shown here in blue. In delivering these objectives, EcoWINGS will produce the following outputs. It will produce datasets and models of offshore wind farm effects on predator-prey dynamics, predictive models of zooplankton and fish under climate change, cumulative impact assessment tools for rapid offshore wind assessments, seabird population projections under compensation scenarios integrating climate change, and an online software tool for whole ecosystem consequences of compensation. And then we will deliver annual advice to government and industry on the most effective compensation that delivers net gain to seabirds and the ecosystem under climate change. Thank you very much.
Hello everyone, I'm here to talk about seabird and marine mammal distributions off the east coast of Scotland from 2020-2021 based on some surveys undertaken by APEM Limited for Marine Scotland. So these were aerial surveys conducted using photographs, and we were contracted to analyse them. And this was a team of researchers from the University of Bangor and Sea-Watch and the University of St Andrews. And here you can see the survey tracks over the 13-month period of the surveys from February 2020 to March 2021. And you can see that there is fairly regular coverage over this entire northeastern sort of EEZ of Scotland, going quite far out to sea. The coverage was mainly in 2020, as you can see here in these two bar charts of the total amount of effort, and by month it was pretty uniform across month, although there are 3 months where no surveys could be done because of bad weather. Now, the typical way in which we analyse this sort of data is that we take, in some sense, what's seen and we allocate it to segments, and then we model those segments using some sort of modelling technique. Now, in this case, we didn't have to correct for detection because photographs are being used. However, we only photograph that which is near the surface, either slightly below the surface or slightly above the surface, perhaps in the case of birds. And so in order to have an estimate of absolute numbers, we really want to correct for availability. Now, we couldn't really do this for birds, but we did do it for cetaceans. So any figures that you see for cetaceans are absolute measures of abundance. For birds, there are relative measures of abundance. And so, like I said, we take the data and we sum the data for little segments of effort over the entire surveyed zone. And in the case of cetaceans, corrected for surface availability. And then we model the numbers associated with each of those segments against a variety of environmental covariates and spatial covariates. So typically longitude and latitude, depth, etc., etc. I can't go into the details of the models because I simply haven't got enough time, but I wanted to show you some the more interesting results. So here we have predictions based on our generalized additive models, based on for each month of the survey. And you can see that most fulmars were seen fairly offshore during the summer period, and that's indicated by the red dots on the transect lines. And you can also see that the models, indicated by the kind of color contours in the summer, do correctly predict where those animals were actually seen. If we consider another species of seabird, kittiwakes, you can see that the animals were mainly seen in the southwest of the survey region, and again the models predicted those numbers. Puffins were slightly different in the sense that animals were seen, but the models actually predicted numbers would be very, very great inshore. Now, the survey lines didn't quite go into the shore. They actually started slightly offshore. And so, to an extent, there's a little bit of extrapolation of the model here. But the models did essentially suggest that the puffins would be in their greatest numbers towards the south and close to the shoreline, which I'm reliably informed by people who know far more about ornithology than me is actually true. We actually modelled 10 species of bird and 3 species of cetacean, but again we're kind of limited for time, so I just wanted to illustrate the results for one species of cetacean, harbour porpoise. That was the cetacean that was most frequently seen, and harbour porpoise is a varying species whose spatial and temporal distribution does tend to vary quite a lot. They're always in fairly large numbers, and we can see here that sometimes they're found inshore, well, very close to the shore. Sometimes they're found quite offshore. Maybe over the period of our survey that they moved a bit more offshore over in the summer. So yes, we've produced predicted presence services for 10 species of bird, 3 species of cetacean, along with associated uncertainty. The variability is high, but our other work suggests that there are fluctuations from year to year, but our results are broadly similar with what's happened in the past. However, in the immediate aftermath, of course, of our surveys, there was an outbreak of disease in various avian populations, which of course will change the overall the overall level of the population. I'm more than happy to take any questions. Thank you very much.